Hello and welcome to News Global with me, Ayushman Singh Jamwal. Our top story: as Russia is set to commence its Victory Day parade tomorrow, the nation seems to be quite nervous as it is bogged down in a 14-month-long war with Ukraine. Authorities have beefed up security after drone strikes on the Kremlin. Not only this, but Russia has also scaled down the celebrations by scrapping the parade in over 6 regions amid fears of Ukrainian strikes. On the other hand, experts say Russia is cancelling Victory Day celebrations in certain regions to hide its military losses and is using the Kremlin drone strike as an excuse.
We are convinced that in fact there are a lot of people in Ukraine for whom it is still a sacred day. There are also veterans who took part in the Great Patriotic War. There are their relatives and friends for whom this day is and will remain holy.
I think we should probably hold the parade to boost patriotism in people, as it's fluctuating now among people due to the special military operation. In my opinion, we need to do the parade so that the people know what our grandfathers, our grandfathers, and our grandmothers went through, so that people would remember, as many begin to forget what May 9 is and what it stands for. During the World War II, our Great Patriotic War, almost every year the parade was held at the Red Square and it inspired people for victory. Why wouldn't we do it now? We must do this for sure. It's a big propaganda move and it should be taken. Otherwise, there's no sense of what is being done in Ukraine without it. Security measures should be tightened as people understand that terrorist acts are possible. It's an important day for us, and they will try to strike at the most vulnerable point for us. But we shouldn't be afraid of it. It's been a tradition for me since I was born, and it's held every year. I can't imagine a year without it if this tradition is broken. I think it should be held so that people must remember and not forget about it. It's our history. All our new upcoming generations should remember it, know it, and don't forget it.
And joining me on the show is Elizabeth Braw, resident fellow at the AEI. Thank you, Ms. Braw, for joining us on CNN News 18. My first question is, in your opinion, is the Kremlin spooked by the optics surrounding Victory Day as it is bogged down by the war in Ukraine? This was a victory of the Soviet Union against the Nazis.
It is a huge paradox. Now, the Victory Day parades have been celebrated ever since the end of the Cold War to celebrate the enormous efforts and sacrifices the Soviet Union, Soviet citizens did during World War II to defeat the Nazis, and it has been a joyful celebration and a very positive one, because defeating Nazism was no mean feat, and it has been also a somber celebration all these years because so many people lost their lives, so many people suffered. But then last year and now this year, Russia faces the paradox that it itself is engaging in a war of aggression against another country. Now, how do you hold a victory parade over an invader when you yourself has become an invader? So it is an impossible circle to square or dilemma to solve, and that's why I think we're seeing these cancellations.
Right, and Ms. Braw, now Ukraine has denied any role in the Kremlin attack. Is there a consensus in the West that this was a false flag operation by the Putin regime?
There is that sense, yes, or rather I should say there is a sense that it's almost impossible to believe anything Russia says, because it has lied so many times throughout this war, beginning with its lie that the statement by Russia they had no intention to invade Ukraine, and we heard that as close to the war as around the 14th, 15th of February. Then a week later, Russia invaded. So it's very difficult to believe anything Russia says. But based on what we know about the drone above the Kremlin, it's extremely unlikely that it was Ukraine. And it could have been a domestic Russian group. It could have been a false flag attack. But it certainly doesn't seem like Ukraine had anything to do with it.
Right. And as compared to 2022, as compared to the last few months, Ukrainian forces are now better armed thanks to the West, and better, their logistics are better planned out. In your opinion, did Putin underestimate Western support to Ukraine?
He certainly did. He saw the West as a divided group of countries that some would some would support Ukraine, the Russians assumed, and some would be very reluctant to support Ukraine. But I think it's also important to remember that the Russians severely underestimated what the Ukrainians themselves would be able to do. Now, they had, I think, a pretty good assessment of the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and their capabilities. But what the Ukrainians completely got wrong, or even forgot to look at, was ordinary Ukrainian civilians' ability to cope with the horrors of war and just keep society going. And that starts with the railway engineers that keep repairing the railway so that it can function to perfection. Power plant engineers who keep electric power going and need all kinds of power going, and down to teachers and all kinds of ordinary Ukrainians who keep society going. I think that was also a fatal mistake the Russians made in planning this invasion.
Right. Ms. Bro, we remember when the conflict started and when Putin started pushing in Russian troops into Ukraine, that draft caused a lot of stir within Russia, where men were kind of forced to fight the war in Ukraine. We saw a lot of Russian families also leaving the country out of fear of being pushed into the war. What is the situation when it comes to this kind of the public sentiments in Russia as we speak right now? Is there a lot of anger against the Putin regime? Because we seldom get any information about public sentiment within Russia. Is Putin on shaky ground within Russia, given the factionalism that has hit the Kremlin as well?
You're absolutely right that we rarely get any information about sentiment within Russia, and it's going to be even more difficult to get a proper picture of how ordinary Russians feel about this war, because, as you know, the Kremlin is cracking down on opposition activists and even on Western journalists. And there is one remaining polling institute that is considered to be reliable, but we have no way of knowing how reliable it is anymore. But this polling institute organization shows that Russians are in favor of the war, but again, we have no way of knowing whether that's accurate, and that is the fog of information, and really lack of information that we are facing when it comes to Russia. But you asked also about the draft and mobilization, and I think this is where Russia faces a really tough uphill battle. It has already mobilized, and we already saw that causing lots of Russian men to leave the country, but it will have to keep mobilizing, can't keep going with the same people all the time. And the more it mobilizes, the more people will leave the country, and the fewer will be left to serve, which is why the Russian armed forces are now so dependent on the Wagner Group.
Absolutely, it has been over a year since the conflict started, and as you were pointing out, but I want you to elaborate. What are the challenges Putin is facing in Ukraine and in Moscow as well, which is preventing an end to this conflict? Now, the mercenary groups which are associated with Russia are now publicly speaking out about the fact that there are massive logistical problems on the ground, while Ukraine is getting its act together, being armed and supplied by the West.
Well, the first problem for Russia starts with motivation. The Ukrainians may not have as much equipment and as many men as the Russians, because Ukraine is a smaller country than Russia, but the Ukrainians are extremely motivated. They're also well trained. And the Russian soldiers, I mean, I don't think any of us would I think we could all understand we can all understand that Russian soldiers serving in this war are asking themselves, what am I doing in Ukraine? What is this for? And we just don't know how prevalent the attitude is, because again, we have very little information from inside Russia, especially from inside the armed forces. But that is the big advantage the Ukrainians have. They are motivated to defend their country, whereas Russian soldiers are clearly not too motivated to do a good job in Ukraine. I think their motivation is merely to survive. And we are seeing already divisions, really sharp divisions, emerge between the leadership of the armed forces and the Wagner Group, which is obviously fighting in exchange for money. It's a mercenary group, and this Wagner Group is saying the armed forces are not giving us enough ammunition, and not giving us enough support, and that may or may not be true. But what is really bad news for Russia is that these divisions are coming to the surface, and that's not good news for a sustained ability to keep fighting against Ukraine.
Right. I want to shift our focus to Western Europe as well, Ms. Bro. At first, when the conflict began, we saw that hesitancy from many Western European nations given their energy dependency on Russia. What, in your opinion, has been that turning point which has created such a consistent and concerted Western response to aiding Ukraine in the conflict?
Well, I think if Russia had invaded and then after a couple of days had said, "Oh, hang on, it was a mistake, we'll pull back," then there might have been some willingness in Western capitals to forget about the whole thing, even though that would have been serious enough in itself. But Russia's insistence on fighting this brutal war and committing so many atrocities against ordinary civilians in Ukraine, I think has turned not just Western governments, but the Western public against Russia. And we should remember that in a liberal democracy, what the public think matters a great deal to what political leaders think. So they know they have the backing of their population in keeping support going for Ukraine, because we all wouldn't want to be the country that's invaded by Russia. In a sense, Western countries are lucky that it's not them, that it's Ukraine, and so they are willing to keep up support for Ukraine, apparently for a very long time.
Right, and my final question, Ms. Bro, are we seeing this conflict all wrong at the same time? Is the end game to annex Ukraine or just to create a buffer zone against the West? Because when it comes to that, when it comes to creation of such a buffer zone, a military buffer zone, Putin has in a way succeeded in creating that.
Well, he has clearly some sort of unhealthy fascination with Ukraine, and he wants Ukraine to be, if not part of Russia, then subservient to Russia. But I think what he doesn't seem to understand is that countries have a right to determine their own destiny and their own future, and Ukraine today doesn't want to belong to Russia and doesn't want to be subservient to Russia. It wants to edge closer towards the West, have closer links to the West, and possibly join the European Union and NATO. And if you can't accept another country's self-determination, I think it's you will engage in some really horrible actions, and that's something that I think most countries around the world understand, that what Russia is doing from that perspective is just unacceptable, which is why we're seeing countries that are ordinarily quite close to Russia voting against Russia in the United Nations, because I think we all want for our countries to be able to determine their own future and not have a large country tell us, no, you can't do this, you can't do that.